Soulless. That's the only word for it. It's technical garbage. Michael's voice cut through the silence of the studio's private screening room. He waved a dismissive hand at the screen where the score my software had generated was playing over the final scene. In front of one of the biggest directors in Hollywood. I stood there, my hands gripping the edge of the mixing console, my face burning with a humiliation so hot it felt like a fever. My project, Symphony AI, the thing I'd poured my life into, was being dismissed as nothing. My name is Hannah, and I'm 28 years old. And I had just watched my mentor, the legendary composer Michael, publicly execute my dream. I walked out of that screening room and didn't stop until I was in the concrete echo of the studio's parking garage. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sickly yellow glow on the rows of expensive cars. I leaned against a cool pillar and let myself breathe. Soulless garbage. The words echoed in my head. My name is Hannah, and for the past 3 years, my entire world had revolved around Michael. Not just any Michael. Michael, the 2-time Oscar-winning composer. The man whose score for The Last Horizon had made me want to write music in the first place. I had studied his work, memorized his orchestrations, dreamed of one day being half as good as he was. When I landed the job as his junior composer and assistant right out of college, it felt like my life was starting. He was a legend. I was his apprentice. It was a dream job, until it wasn't. The first year was incredible. I learned so much just by watching him work. He was demanding, meticulous, a true perfectionist. But he was also brilliant. He could find a melody in anything, a harmony that could break your heart with just 3 notes. I was in awe, but slowly I started to notice the cracks, the deadlines he started missing, the long afternoons spent staring at a blank sheet of music, his frustration, a palpable thing in the studio. The themes he started to repeat, subtle variations on his old work, hoping no one would notice. The genius was still there, but the spark, the fire, it was fading. He was creatively exhausted, burned out from decades of pressure to be brilliant on command, and the more he struggled, the more he noticed me. Not my work, but my ease. I was young, hungry. Ideas came to me quickly. Little melodies I'd hum while making coffee chord progressions. I'd sketch out during my lunch break. He'd hear them, and I'd see a flicker of something in his eyes. Not encouragement. Something closer to resentment. That was when I started working on Symphony AI. It was my secret project, something I built on my own time, on my own laptop. It wasn't a replacement for a composer. It was a tool, an assistant. It was based on the complex musical theories my father, a brilliant but unpublished music professor, had spent his life developing. He believed music was a language, a form of mathematics, and that its emotional structures could be mapped. After he passed away, I took his notebooks filled with equations and theories, and I turned them into code. Symphony AI could analyze a scene, understand its emotional intent, tension, release, sorrow, joy, and then generate melodic options, harmonic structures, and orchestrations based on my father's principles. It was a way to break through creative blocks. It was a way to keep my father's legacy alive. It was mine. Then came the assignment for a short animated film. It was a small project, a favor for a director friend of his, but Michael was completely stuck. For 2 weeks I watched him struggle, growing more irritable each day. He hated everything he wrote. One afternoon he found me testing a new module for the software. "What is that?" he asked, his voice sharp. I hesitated, protective of my creation. "It's just a personal project, a composition tool I've been developing." He peered at the screen, at the lines of code, and the elegant interface. "Does it work?" "It helps," I said carefully. It generates ideas. He was quiet for a long moment, watching as the AI composed a simple, beautiful piano piece to accompany a silent clip of a falling leaf. I need you to use that for the animated short, he said finally. It wasn't a request. It was an order. Michael, I don't know. I started. It's not really ready for a real project, and it's based on my dad's. I don't have time to write it myself, and the deadline is Friday. He cut me off. Just get it done. It's a minor project. Nobody will even notice. Part of me knew it was a mistake. A voice in the back of my head screamed that I was giving away something precious. But another part, the part that still worshipped the composer he used to be, wanted to help him. I wanted to impress him. I wanted him to finally see me as more than just an assistant, so I agreed. I spent the next 2 days working with Symphony AI, guiding its suggestions, weaving its ideas into a complete score. The result was beautiful. It was nuanced, emotional, and perfectly suited to the film. It was some of the best work I had ever done. I delivered the score on Friday morning. Michael listened to it once, his face unreadable, and just said, "Fine." "It'll do." That was it. No thank you, no acknowledgement of the sleepless nights I'd put in. 2 weeks later, the director of the animated short called the studio raving about the music. He said it was the most original and moving score Michael had written in years. Michael accepted the praise without mentioning my name. He took the credit, every last drop of it. I sat in my small cubicle just outside his main studio, listening through the open door, and I felt myself disappear. A ghost in my own success. But worse than the stolen credit was the change in Michael. After that, he became colder, more demanding. He'd criticize my arrangements for other projects, nitpick my orchestrations, find fault in everything I did. It was like he couldn't stand the fact that I had succeeded where he had failed. He needed to put me back in my place to remind me that I was the assistant and he was the master. The final blow came a month after the animated short was released. He called me into his office. The room was dark, the only light coming from the computer, monitors displaying a complex score. "Hannah, we need to talk about your software," he said, the word tasting like something unpleasant in his mouth. "What about it?" "The studio's legal team is asking about it." He lied. "If we're going to be using it on projects, we need to have a formal licensing agreement in place." My stomach tightened. "Michael, it's a personal project. It's not a commercial product. It's based on my father's theories. Everything you create while under my employment is technically the property of this studio," he said, his voice dangerously smooth. "But I'm willing to be generous. We won't take ownership. We'll just pay for its use." He slid a piece of paper across the desk. It was an invoice made out to me from his personal corporation, for software licensing and consultation. The amount made my vision blur. $24,000. "What is this?" I whispered. "I don't have this kind of money." "That's the fee," he said simply. "For the use of your software on the animated short. The budget was generous. We can afford it. But that money was paid to you for the score. And I used your tool to create it. You're a vendor, Hannah. This is your fee." The logic was so twisted, so predatory, I couldn't even wrap my head around it. He was charging me with his money for my own work. "I can't pay this," I said, my voice shaking. "This is everything I have. My savings, the money I'd been carefully putting away since college for a down payment on a small condo, it was almost exactly $24,000. He knew. I don't know how, but he knew. "You're a talented composer," he said, his voice softening into a mask of mentorship, "but you're naive about the business. This is how it works. Consider this a lesson. an investment in your education. He leaned back, his face a mask of false concern. If you can't handle the financial realities of this industry, maybe you're not cut out for it. There it was. The threat wrapped in a blanket of condescending advice. Pay me or your career is over. Pay me or the man you've admired your whole life will destroy you. I know what you're thinking. Why didn't you just walk out? Why didn't you tell him to take his invoice and shove it? Why would anyone agree to such a monstrously unfair demand? It's a question people ask when they see someone trapped, and from the outside, the solution always seems so simple. Just leave. But what you don't see from the outside are the invisible chains. For years I had lived in a prison that had no bars. Its walls were built from my own desperate hope for Michael's approval. Its locks were forged from the fear that if I displeased him, he would blacklist me from the only industry I ever wanted to work in. He wasn't just my boss, he was the gatekeeper to my entire world. And when you're a prisoner in a place like that, you don't try to break down the walls. You learn to survive. You make yourself smaller, quieter. You tell yourself that the abuse isn't really abuse, it's just a test. That if you can just endure it a little longer, if you can just prove your loyalty one more time, the door will finally open. My silence wasn't weakness. It was the calculated, desperate strategy of a survivor clinging to the belief that tomorrow might be the day the warden finally shows you mercy. I looked at the invoice again, at the cold black numbers that represented my entire future. Then I looked at Michael, at the man who held my dreams in his hand and was preparing to crush them. "Okay," I whispered. My voice didn't even sound like my own. "I'll pay it." His smile was barely there, but I saw it, the flicker of triumph in his eyes. He had won. "Good," he said. "I knew you'd be reasonable." I walked back to my desk, my legs feeling like they belonged to someone else. I opened my banking app. $24,112.58. I typed in the full amount for the transfer. As I hit confirm, I didn't just hear the quiet chime of the app. I heard the sound of a door slamming shut, the sound of my own future draining away. The soft click of the door opening barely registered at first. I was still staring at the confirmation screen on my phone, at the empty space where my future used to be. My world had shrunk to that single, devastating number. 0. "Michael, I didn't realize you had a meeting." The voice was cool, crisp, and carried an authority that cut through the thick silence of the studio. I looked up. Standing in the doorway was Victoria. Victoria, the head of the production company that funded our entire studio. She was in her late 40s, always impeccably dressed in a suit that probably cost more than my car, with her silver hair cut in a sharp, elegant bob. She was the one who signed the checks, the one who could make or break careers with a single phone call. Michael, who had been leaning back in his chair with that smug, triumphant look, suddenly sat up straight. "Victoria, this isn't on the calendar. We weren't expecting you." I was in the building for a meeting with legal. It ran short. She walked into the room, her heels clicking softly on the polished concrete floor. Her eyes, a pale, intelligent blue, swept the room and landed on me. I was still standing by his desk, my phone clutched in my hand like a lifeline. I must have looked like a wreck. She offered me a small, unreadable smile before turning her attention back to Michael. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all," Michael said, a little too quickly. "Hannah and I were just finalizing some administrative details." Victoria's gaze drifted to the invoice still sitting on his desk. She didn't pick it up. She didn't have to. She just looked at it for a long, silent moment. I felt my heart start to pound a slow, heavy drumbeat against my ribs. "Administrative details," Victoria repeated, her voice perfectly neutral. It sounded more like a lesson. An investment in education, I believe you called it. The blood drained from Michael's face. He had been so confident, so sure of his power, that he hadn't even bothered to close his office door all the way. The screening room was soundproof, but his office wasn't. Victoria's meeting with legal was just down the hall. She had heard, maybe not everything, but she had heard enough. That was a private conversation, Michael said, his voice tight. Was it? Victoria walked over to the window and looked out at the sprawling studio lot below, because it sounded like a business transaction, a rather unusual one. She turned back, her eyes landing on him. A software licensing fee, you said, for a project developed by your assistant. I stood frozen, watching this unfold like a movie. I was a spectator to my own life. It's an internal matter, Victoria Michael said, attempting to regain his authority. Hannah agreed to the terms. Did she? Victoria looked at me then, a direct, probing gaze. Hannah, did you feel you had a choice? I opened my mouth, but no words came out. I just shook my head, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement, but Victoria saw it. I see, she said softly. She turned back to Michael. So, let me make sure I understand the sequence of events. You were struggling to compose the score for the animated short. You discovered Hannah had a proprietary software tool that could help. You had her use it to complete the score. She paused. You then took sole credit for that score, which received significant praise. Michael's jaw was clenched. Hannah was compensated for her time as my assistant. Of course, Victoria continued, ignoring his interruption. And after taking credit for her work, you then presented her with an invoice for $24,000, a licensing fee for the very software she used to save your project. A fee which, I'm guessing, happens to be the entirety of her personal savings. The way she laid it all out so calmly, so clinically, made it sound even more monstrous than it had felt. It wasn't a lesson. It was extortion. You have no right to interfere in how I manage my department. Michael finally spat out, his composure cracking. Michael, Victoria said, and her voice was suddenly ice. I don't just fund your department. I own it. Every piece of equipment, every contract, every salary. It all comes from my company's investment. And I have every right to be concerned when my star composer is shaking down his junior assistant for cash after stealing her work. It's not a good look. She walked over to his desk and finally picked up the invoice, holding it between two fingers as if it were contaminated. This is a problem, Michael. A very big problem. Because it suggests a pattern of behavior that I find deeply troubling. It suggests that the composer we're paying millions of dollars a year might not be producing the work we're paying for. He was on his feet now, his face red, with a mixture of fury and panic. That's a ridiculous accusation. The animated short was a minor project. Was it Victoria's voice was dangerously quiet now? Because the director just submitted your name for an Emmy nomination for Best Original Score for a special? He seems to think it was more than a minor project. I felt the air leave my lungs. An Emmy nomination for my work under his name. Victoria let that sink in for a moment. Then she looked at me, her expression softening almost imperceptibly. Hannah, I believe you were on your way out. Why don't you take the rest of the day off with pay? Go home and get some rest. We have a lot to discuss. It was a dismissal, but for the first time it felt like a rescue. I nodded, unable to speak, and turned to leave. As I reached the door, I heard Victoria's voice no longer quiet, but filled with a cold, clear authority. And Michael, don't go anywhere. You and I are going to have a very long, very detailed conversation about the definition of the word collaboration. I walked down the hall in a daze. My own desk, with its familiar clutter of sheet music and half-finished coffee cups, seemed like a scene from someone else's life. I should have kept walking straight out the front door and never looked back, but my legs wouldn't obey. I sank into my chair, my body trembling, my mind a blank, static hum. The door to Michael's office was still ajar. And then I heard his voice, not booming, not confident, pleading. Victoria, you're overreacting. It was a simple disagreement, a teaching moment. A teaching moment that cost my company $24,000 in productivity while you humiliated a valuable employee. Victoria's voice was calm, but it had an edge that could cut glass. Tell me, Michael, when was the last time you composed something truly new? What are you talking about? My work speaks for itself. Does it? Because from where I'm standing, your last 3 scores have been predictable, safe, rehashes of your past glories. This studio pays you a fortune to be a genius. But for the past 2 years, you've been coasting on the talent of your assistants, while your own well has run dry. There was a long silence. I could picture him standing there, his face, a mask of disbelief that was slowly hardening into rage. And now Victoria continued. Instead of mentoring the next generation, you're threatened by it. You see a young woman with a genuinely innovative idea, and you don't foster it. You steal it, and then you try to crush her spirit for having it in the first place. You've become a liability, Michael. Your fear of becoming irrelevant is costing this company talent and money. You can't do this, he whispered the words, shaking. We've known each other for 20 years. And for 20 years I have watched you become more arrogant and less creative, she replied. This was the last straw. Effective immediately, my company is withdrawing all funding from this studio. We're dissolving our partnership. You'll what? His voice was a choked sound. And with that capital, Victoria's voice grew stronger, clearer. I am launching a new venture, a music technology firm that will specialize in composing for new media, a company that values innovation, not just reputation. And its first project will be the full-scale development of a software called Symphony AI. A new company. With me at the center. The idea was so enormous, I couldn't hold it in my mind. You're going to build a company around her. Michael's voice was pure venom now. She's a child, a nobody. That software is a gimmick. It's nothing without a real composer to guide it. Then it's a good thing it will have one, Victoria said. Hannah. I flinched as she called my name. I stood up slowly and walked back to the doorway of his office. Victoria was standing by the window, her back to me. Michael was staring at her, his face pale with shock. He turned as I entered, and the look in his eyes was pure hatred. Come in, Hannah, Victoria said, turning to face me. Michael and I are just discussing your new job. This is insane, Michael sputtered. You can't just hand my company over to an assistant. I'm not Victoria, corrected him. I'm starting a new one. You are free to take your name and your back catalog and try to find funding elsewhere. I wish you the best of luck. She looked at me, a question in her eyes. Hannah, are you in? I looked from Victoria's calm, determined face to Michael's twisted expression of rage. It was a choice. Stay in the shadow of the man who tried to break me, or step into the light with the woman who was offering me a chance to build something of my own. It wasn't even a choice. Yes, I said, my voice finally steady. I'm in. Michael let out a sound, somewhere between a laugh and a sob, and then he was gone, storming out of the office and slamming the door behind him. The silence he left behind was heavy. Victoria walked over to me. She looked tired, older than she had just moments before. I finally found the words that had been stuck in my throat. "Why?" I asked. "Why are you doing this for me?" She walked to the window, staring out at the city for a long moment before she spoke. The last thing I expected was for her to start with a confession. A secret she'd told no one else at the studio. "The doctors tell me I have at most 2 years left," she said, her voice flat, devoid of self-pity. ALS. "It's progressing faster than they expected." I just stood there, stunned into silence. "For months," she continued, "I've been thinking about my legacy. What do I leave behind? A portfolio of successful films, a reputation for being a tough negotiator. It all felt so empty. I've spent 20 years managing assets, managing egos, managing men like Michael." She turned from the window to look at me, and for the first time I saw a profound sadness in her eyes. I saw what he was. For years. I saw his jealousy, his cruelty, the way he took credit from his assistants. And I did nothing, because it was easier to keep the hitmaker happy than to do what was right. That was my failure, my silent regret. She took a breath, and it seemed to cost her something. "Then today I heard him with you. I heard him trying to break you, and I realized I had a choice. I could spend my last 2 years managing the slow decline of a dying system, or I could use what time I have to build something new, something that matters." She looked at my phone still clutched in my hand. "That software your father's work? That's a real legacy, Hannah. That's about creating. Michael is about the past. You are about the future. My illness is a deadline. It's the why now. It's forcing me to finally stop being a manager and start being a creator again. I'm not just saving you. I'm trying to save what's left of my own soul." The next morning, I met Victoria at a quiet cafe downtown, a world away from the sterile, high-pressure environment of the studio. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. It felt calm, normal. It felt like the beginning of something new. We ordered coffee, and for a few minutes we just sat in a comfortable silence. "Are you okay?" she asked, finally, her gaze direct. "I think so," I said, and I was surprised to find it was true. Overwhelmed, confused, but okay. Good, because what comes next is going to be difficult. She took a sip of her espresso. Dissolving the partnership with Michael is messy. There will be legal battles, press releases, industry gossip. He won't go quietly. I understand. But before all that, she said, setting her cup down carefully, there's something else you need to understand about Michael, about why he did what he did. I waited, my hands wrapped around my warm mug. "This wasn't just about professional jealousy, Hannah," she began. "It runs deeper than that. This is about your father." The name hung in the air between us. I hadn't expected to hear his name. Not here, not now. My father, he was a music theory professor. Michael never even met him. "Oh, he knew him," Victoria said, a grim look on her face. "Or rather, he knew of him. They were contemporaries 25 years ago. Both of them were young composers in Los Angeles trying to get their first break." This was a part of my father's life I knew almost nothing about. He never spoke of his time in LA, only that he'd decided the industry wasn't for him and moved into academia instead. "Your father," Victoria continued, "was, by all accounts, a genius, truly innovative. His ideas about harmonic structure and emotional resonance were years ahead of their time. But he was an academic, not a salesman. He was terrible at networking, at playing the political games you need to play in Hollywood." "And Michael," I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Michael was the opposite. Talented, yes, but his real gift was ambition. He knew how to get into the right rooms, how to say the right things. He and your father were both up for the same project, a small indie film that ended up becoming a surprise critical success. Everyone knew your father's demo was the better score, more original, more powerful. But Michael got the job. How? He sabotaged him, Victoria said flatly. Convinced the director that your father was too experimental, unreliable. He played on their fears of the unknown. And it worked. The score Michael wrote for that film won him his first major award and launched his career. Your father, heartbroken and disgusted with the industry, left L.A. and never looked back. I sat there, the story settling over me like a shroud, a ghost story I never knew I was a part of. All those years I'd thought my father had simply chosen a different path. But he hadn't chosen it. He'd been pushed. It explains so much, I said quietly. His bitterness towards the industry, why he never encouraged me to follow this path. He was trying to protect you, Victoria said. But the world is different now, Hannah. And Michael's time is over. He's been running on fumes for years, and he knows it. That's why he was so threatened by you. He didn't just see a talented assistant. He saw your father's ghost walking through his door. The pieces were clicking into place, forming a picture that was darker and more complex than I could have imagined. Michael's resentment, his cruelty, it wasn't just about me. It was about a rivalry that had haunted him for decades. But it's even more specific than that, Victoria said, leaning forward. Her voice dropped. It's about Symphony AI. Tell me, where did the core principles of the software come from? From my father's notebooks, I said. His unpublished theories on musical structure and emotional mathematics. It was his life's work. I just translated it into code. Victoria closed her eyes for a moment, a look of grim confirmation on her face. That's it then. That's what he was so afraid of. What are you talking about? She opened her eyes, and they were filled with a cold, hard clarity. Hannah, when Michael heard that score for the animated short, he didn't just hear a brilliant piece of music. He heard your father. He recognized the signature, the theoretical framework, the very genius that he had spent his entire career trying to bury. The coffee cup felt impossibly heavy in my hands. I set it down before I dropped it. He wasn't just stealing credit from you, Victoria said, her voice precise and cutting. He was trying to steal your father's legacy for a second time, and when he couldn't own it, he tried to destroy it. By taking your money, by crushing your confidence. He wasn't just trying to get rid of a competitor. He was trying to silence the ghost that had come back to prove he was a fraud all along. The truth of it hit me with the force of a physical blow. The stolen credit, the $24,000 invoice. It wasn't just a cruel act of a desperate man. It was a calculated, vicious attempt to erase my father's memory from the world. Symphony AI wasn't just my project. It was my inheritance. It was my father's soul coded into existence. And Michael had tried to desecrate it. I looked at Victoria, at this woman who had in the space of 24 hours become the most important ally in my life. The fight had changed. This was no longer about my career. It was no longer about proving Michael wrong. This was about justice. For my father. For the music he never got to write. For the legacy that Michael had tried and failed to bury twice. What do we do now? I asked, and my voice was no longer shaking. It was cold. It was steady. It was ready. The first tremor wasn't an earthquake. It was a whisper. Hollywood is a city built on secrets, and a story like this was too good to stay quiet for long. It started with anonymous posts on industry forums, the kind everyone reads, but no one admits to. Rumor has it, a certain Oscar-winning composer is in hot water for borrowing from his assistant. Anyone hear about the meltdown at Victoria's studio? Victoria had moved me into a guest suite in her penthouse apartment, a glass fortress high above the city. For your safety, she'd said, though I knew it was also to keep me close to manage the storm she knew was coming. From her floor to ceiling windows, I watched the world below continue on oblivious, while my own world was quietly coming apart and then being rebuilt all at once. My phone was a minefield. I'd muted the notifications, but I could feel the phantom buzzes of texts from my old colleagues, from friends, from people I hadn't spoken to in years. Don't answer any of them, Victoria advised, handing me a cup of tea that probably cost more than my weekly groceries. Right now, we control the narrative by saying nothing. The whispers grew louder. The story started to take shape, details leaking from the studio. The Emmy nomination for the animated short became the focal point. It was a tangible, verifiable piece of the puzzle. Industry blogs started asking questions. Why was a junior composer's experimental software used on an Emmy-nominated score, and why was her name nowhere in the credits? My name, Hannah, started appearing in the comments sections. Then my photo, a grainy headshot from my college graduation, was posted on a gossip site. I was no longer an anonymous assistant. I was a character in a story, The Wronged Prodigy. Victoria was my shield. Her legal team sent out carefully worded statements. Her PR people managed the inquiries. I spent my days in her quiet, sunlit apartment working on Symphony AI, refining the code, adding new features. The work grounded me. It was the only thing that felt real. Every line of code was a small act of defiance. Every new melody the AI generated was a testament to my father's legacy, a legacy I was now the guardian of. Meanwhile, Michael was silent. He'd barricaded himself in his mansion, refusing to take calls, issuing no statements. He thought he could weather it. He was Michael, after all, a Hollywood institution. And institutions don't fall easily. But the pressure was building. I heard from my friend Chloe, a cellist who still worked at the studio, that half the staff had quit in protest. Projects were stalled. The studio was hemorrhaging money. Victoria's withdrawal of funding had been a fatal blow. Then after a week of silence, Michael made his move. It was exactly what Victoria predicted he would do. He decided to go on the offensive. He agreed to a live exclusive interview, not with a major news network. That would be too formal, too controlled. He chose a podcast, the most influential music podcast in the industry, The Composer's Chair. Its host Julian was known for his deep knowledge of music and his deceptively gentle interview style. He could dismantle a guest's entire argument without ever raising his voice. He was a surgeon with words. He thinks he can control it, Victoria said, looking at the press release on her tablet. He thinks he can sit down with Julian, play the part of the misunderstood genius, talk about the pressures of creativity, and spin this whole thing as a mentor-student disagreement that got blown out of proportion. He thinks he can charm his way out of it. Can he? I asked, my voice small. Victoria looked at me, a rare, cold smile on her lips. He's walking into a trap, but he's so arrogant he thinks he'd designed it himself. The night of the interview, Victoria and I watched from her home office on a large screen. She had a bottle of expensive whiskey and 2 glasses on the table, but she didn't pour any. Not yet, she said. We celebrate after. The podcast studio was intimate, minimalist. Just 2 chairs, a table, and the microphones. Julian looked calm, professional. Then Michael walked in. He was dressed in a tailored black suit, his silver hair perfectly in place. He looked tired, but he smiled for the cameras, projecting an aura of confidence of a man completely in control. He sat down across from Julian, adjusted his microphone, and folded his hands on the table. He was ready to perform. I held my breath as the on-air sign lit up. Welcome back to the composer's chair. Julian's smooth voice filled the room. My guest tonight needs no introduction. A living legend, a multiple Oscar winner, and the man behind some of the most iconic scores in cinema history. Michael, thank you for being here. It's my pleasure, Julian Michael said, his voice a familiar, reassuring baritone. There's a lot to talk about, Julian said, his expression giving nothing away. But I suppose we should start with the story that everyone in Hollywood seems to be discussing this week. Let's, Michael said, leaning into the microphone, his expression one of pained sincerity. There have been a lot of rumors, a lot of misinformation. I'm glad to have a chance to clear the air. So tell me your side of it, Julian said, his tone inviting open. A score you submitted for an animated short is now at the center of a controversy involving your former assistant, Hannah. Hannah is a wonderfully talented young woman. Michael began, his voice dripping with condescension disguised as affection. I took her under my wing, tried to mentor her. But the pressure of this industry, it's not for everyone. There was a disagreement over creative credit, a misunderstanding that has been blown completely out of proportion. She's young and, I think, a little overwhelmed. He was painting me as a hysterical, unstable girl. I gripped the arm of my chair, my knuckles white. Victoria just watched the screen, her expression unreadable. A misunderstanding, Julian pressed gently. The score is now nominated for an Emmy. It's being called one of the most innovative pieces of the year, but Hannah's name isn't on it. Why is that? As I said, she's my assistant, Michael said smoothly. Her work, like the work of all my assistants, is done under my direction, under my name. That is standard industry practice. She was compensated for her work. This is simply a case of a young artist wanting to run before she can walk. He was good. He was so plausible. To anyone who didn't know the truth, he sounded like a reasonable, patient mentor, dealing with an ambitious upstart. But this score was different, wasn't it? Julian asked. It was generated at least in part by a piece of software she developed, an AI composition tool. Michael laughed, a soft, dismissive sound. An AI tool. It sounds so futuristic, doesn't it? In reality, it was a simple program, a sketchpad, really. It generated a few melodic fragments, which I then developed into the final score. It was a tool like a piano or a synthesizer, the artistry, the soul of the music that came from me. So you're saying the software's contribution was minimal? Essentially, yes. It was a starting point, nothing more. I watched my heart pounding as Julian paused. He looked down at his notes for a moment, then looked back up at Michael, his gaze level. That's interesting. Because the director of the short film said the score was, and I quote, a complete departure from Michael's recent work with a harmonic complexity that felt entirely new. He credited the score's genius as the reason the film has resonated so deeply. Michael's smile tightened just a fraction. I was feeling inspired. I was trying something new. Were you, Julian leaned forward slightly? Or were you using someone else's inspiration? Michael, there are whispers that this new sound isn't new at all, that it's based on the theoretical work of a composer from your early days, a brilliant music theorist who left the industry under difficult circumstances. Hannah's father. There it was, the ghost at the table. I watched Michael's face. The charming, confident mask didn't just crack, it shattered. For a split second, I saw pure, unadulterated panic in his eyes. He recovered quickly, but the damage was done. "That's a ridiculous, unfounded accusation," he said, his voice a little too loud. "I barely knew the man. He was a failed academic who couldn't handle the realities of this business." "But you were aware of his theories," Julian pressed. "His work on mathematical, emotional structures in music?" "I may have read some of his papers years ago. It was academic nonsense, unusable in any practical sense." Unusable Julian's voice was still quiet, but it was relentless. "Because my team did some research. We ran a comparative analysis between the Emmy-nominated score and your father-in-law's unpublished manuscripts, which Hannah provided to us. The structural similarities, the harmonic progressions, the melodic patterns, they're not just similar, Michael. They're identical. It's his musical DNA woven into every bar." The room was silent. On screen, Michael just stared at Julian. The mask was gone. All that was left was the raw, furious face of a man who had just been cornered. "You had no right," he hissed. "He was nothing." Michael's voice suddenly erupted raw and shaking, with a rage that seemed to come from a place decades deep. "He was a theorist in an ivory tower who never had the guts to make it. He wrote papers, I wrote symphonies. He dreamed about music. I bled for it." The camera zoomed in on his face, on the spittle flying from his lips, the vein throbbing in his temple. This wasn't a performance anymore. This was a confession. His ideas were nothing. Michael raged, pointing a trembling finger at the camera as if he were pointing at me, at my father's ghost. "They were just equations on a page. I took them. I took his soulless academic garbage and I gave it life. I made it sing that Emmy nomination. That's mine. I earned it. I deserve it. He was a failure, and his legacy belongs to me." He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving, his eyes wild. The silence that followed was absolute. Julian just sat there, his expression a mixture of professional calm and human shock. The on-air sign glowed a small red witness to the complete and utter self-destruction of a legend. Michael seemed to realize too late what he had done. The fury drained from his face, replaced by a dawning, sickening horror. He looked around the studio as if seeing it for the first time, as if waking from a nightmare, only to find it was real. He had just admitted on the most popular music podcast in the world that he had stolen the life's work of a dead man. In the quiet of her office, Victoria slowly reached for the bottle of whiskey. She poured 2 glasses, her hand perfectly steady. She pushed one across the table to me. I looked at her, then back at the screen where Michael's horrified face was frozen in a silent scream. I believe Victoria said, her voice a low, satisfied murmur, "It's time for that celebration." The on-air sign went dark. The screen was just Michael's face frozen in that silent scream. Then it cut to the podcast's logo. The interview was over. My phone, which I'd left on the table, started to vibrate. A low, angry buzz that didn't stop. Then Victoria's phone started, and then her tablet. It was a chorus of notifications, a symphony of digital collapse. I picked up my phone. The clip was already everywhere, sliced into a 60-second segment of pure career-ending rage looping endlessly. Hashtags were trending. Number 1, Michael meltdown. Number 2, justice for Hannah's father. Victoria watched the screen, her expression calm, surgical. "The first wave is public opinion," she said, her voice a low murmur. "The second wave is financial. It should start right about now." As if on cue, her private line rang a sharp, piercing sound that cut through the buzz of the notifications. She answered, putting it on speaker. "Victoria." The voice was a familiar baritone, the head of Paramount's music division. He didn't bother with pleasantries. "We saw the podcast. We're invoking the morals clause on the Crimson Sky contract. Effective immediately. His services are no longer required. Just like that. A $50 million project. Gone. The line went dead. Before she could even hang up, another call came in. A different studio head. Warner Brothers. Victoria, regarding the score for Winter's Echo, were going in a different direction. Another one gone. Then an email alert flashed on her tablet. A headline from Variety pushed to subscribers just seconds ago. Michael's on-air meltdown puts multiple blockbuster scores in jeopardy. It wasn't a fire anymore. It was an inferno. I watched it happen feeling strangely detached, like I was observing a weather pattern from space. It took him 30 years to build that empire. 30 years of awards magazine covers standing ovations. 30 years of being a god, and it all burned to the ground in less than an hour. But the podcast wasn't the fire. It was just the match. The kindling had been there for years, piled up in the quiet resentments of every assistant he'd ever belittled, every musician he'd ever dismissed, every peer who had smiled at his face and whispered about him behind his back. The industry hadn't loved him. They'd feared him. And the moment he showed weakness, they were coming for him. Chloe texted me. The studio is a ghost town. Everyone's just gone. People are sharing stories in the group chat, things I never knew, about him stealing melodies from other assistants years ago, about the verbal abuse. I'm so sorry, Hannah. We all knew he was difficult. We just didn't know he was a monster. Her words meant more than she knew. This wasn't just my fight anymore. It was for all of them, all the people he had made feel small. By midnight, it was a total rout. His talent agency had issued a press release stating they had parted ways with him. The Academy announced they were reviewing his membership status. Every single project he was attached to had either fired him or put him on indefinite hold. It was a professional execution, swift and total. I stood at Victoria's window looking out at the endless grid of city lights, a million separate stories twinkling in the darkness. His story, the one he had so carefully, so brutally constructed, was over. The grand symphony of his career hadn't ended with a beautiful fading chord. It had ended with a crash. A single, ugly, deafening noise that would echo for the rest of his life. The legal battle, when it came, wasn't a battle at all. It was a formality, an epilogue. Victoria's lawyers filed the copyright infringement suit on my father's behalf with me, as the executor of his estate. The podcast confession was Exhibit A. The musicological analysis, comparing the animated short score to my father's manuscripts, was Exhibit B. There was no Exhibit C. There didn't need to be. Michael's legal team, or what was left of it, tried to argue that the theories were public domain, that musical ideas couldn't be copyrighted. But my father's notebooks were unpublished, his work proprietary. And Michael's own words, his furious televised admission that he had taken it, had sealed his fate. The court case lasted less than a week. The judge ruled decisively in our favor. Michael was ordered to pay millions in damages that would be funneled directly into the new company. He was forced to issue a public statement retracting his Emmy nomination and acknowledging my father's work as the foundation for the score. And then the district attorney's office announced they were pressing criminal charges for intellectual property theft. His name, once a synonym for musical genius, was now permanently linked to the words fraud and thief. It was only then, watching the news reports detail his final, irrevocable disgrace, that I truly understood what had happened to him. People who build their lives on a lie are like men living in a house they don't own a house, rented with the currency of past glories. Michael had a reputation. He had awards. He had a legacy. But he no longer was a great composer. The creative well had run dry decades ago, leaving him with nothing but the hollow shell of a name. His power, his influence, his very identity in Hollywood was just a facade rented with money and fear. He wasn't a king, he was a tenant. And when the truth came to collect the rent, he was bankrupt. He had nothing real inside him left to stand on. All that was left was the rage of a man who knew his own emptiness better than anyone and had just been forced to show it to the world. He didn't go to jail. His lawyers negotiated a plea deal involving community service and a massive fine. But it didn't matter. In Hollywood, there are fates worse than prison. He became a ghost. His name was scrubbed from old projects, his music quietly replaced in anniversary editions of films. Aspiring composers were taught his story as a cautionary tale, a lesson in hubris and theft. He wasn't just ruined. He was being erased. The victory was total. It was absolute. And as I sat in Victoria's silent office, watching the final news report fade to black, I felt a profound and unsettling quiet. It was done. It was all done. But the silence that followed didn't feel like peace. It felt like a void. Victoria passed away in the spring, almost 2 years after she'd walked into Michael's office and changed my life. Her decline was, as she had predicted, fast, but she faced it with the same unsentimental courage she faced everything else. There was no funeral. That wasn't her style. Instead, she left instructions for a small gathering at her penthouse, a final party for the handful of people she considered her real family. Me, her lawyers, a few old friends from the film industry. We drank her best whiskey and told stories about her laughing more than we cried because that's what she would have wanted. In the weeks that followed, I finalized the sale of Symphony AI. A major studio, one of the ones that had fired Michael, made an offer that was too good to refuse. $100 million. The number was so abstract, it felt like a typo. They didn't just want the software. They wanted its story. They saw its potential not just as a tool, but as a symbol of the industry's future. I could have kept it run the company myself. Victoria had left me everything I needed to do so. But holding on to it felt like holding on to the past. My father's legacy wasn't in the code itself, but in the innovation it represented. The best way to honor him and to honor Victoria was to let it grow, to let it become part of the very fabric of the industry that had once cast them both aside. After the deal was done, I sat in my apartment staring at a bank statement that didn't feel real. The money was a weight, not a burden, but a responsibility. The silence I'd felt after Michael's fall had returned, and I knew I had to fill it with something meaningful or it would consume me. I could have bought a mansion, a yacht, a life of idle luxury, but all I could think about was that conversation in Victoria's office about her legacy, about building something that mattered. That's when I finally understood what I had to do. There are two kinds of justice in this world. The first is the justice of the sword. It is the justice of punishment, of retribution. It's about looking backward at the wrong that was done and making the person who did it pay. I'd had that justice. I'd watched Michael fall. I'd watched his world burn, and it had brought a certain satisfaction, a cold, clean feeling of a debt being settled. But in the end, it was an empty victory. It was an ending, not a beginning. Then there is the other kind of justice, the justice of the sower. This justice isn't about looking back at the fields that were burned. It's about looking forward at the empty fields and planting something new. It's not about vengeance. It's about creation. It's the ultimate act of power because it renders the destruction of the past irrelevant. It says, what you broke doesn't matter because I am building something that will grow 100 times stronger in its place. I called my lawyers the next day. I told them I wanted to establish a foundation. a nonprofit dedicated to funding and mentoring the next generation of composers, especially those working at the intersection of music and technology. Young artists with brilliant unconventional ideas who were being dismissed by the Michaels of the world. It would provide grants, scholarships, access to resources, and the kind of mentorship I had once so desperately craved. I named it the Victoria Fund. It was the only name that made sense. This wasn't just my victory anymore. It was hers too. It was our answer to the silence, to the void. We weren't going to spend our lives fighting the ghosts of the past. We were going to invest in the symphonies of the future. The work filled the quiet. It gave the money a purpose. And for the first time since that day in the screening room, the feeling in my chest wasn't victory and it wasn't emptiness. It was peace. The first grant from the Victoria Fund went to a 19-year-old girl from Ohio who had developed an algorithm that could compose music based on human brainwaves. Her professors had called it a novelty. I called it revolutionary. I flew her out to LA, set her up in a studio, and watched her create something the world had never heard before. The second went to a team of programmers in Austin who were building an open-source platform for collaborative real-time scoring, a tool that would democratize music creation for filmmakers everywhere. One by one we found them, the outsiders, the rebels, the quiet geniuses working in their basements and dorm rooms, the ones who were told their ideas were too strange, too different, too far ahead of their time. We didn't just give them money. We gave them a community, a place where they weren't the odd one out, but the pioneers. Last week, I was in one of our studios watching a young composer guide a string quartet through a piece she had co-written with Symphony AI. The music was complex, beautiful, and utterly new. She was nervous, her hands shaking slightly as she gave notes to the seasoned musicians, but her eyes were bright with a fierce, determined light I recognized. It was the same light I saw in the mirror now, the light of someone who had finally found her voice. She looked over at me, a silent question in her eyes. I just smiled and nodded. Keep going. As I drove home that evening, the city lights blurring past my window, I thought about the strange, painful, beautiful journey that had brought me here. I thought about Michael, a ghost now, a cautionary tale. I thought about Victoria, a legacy of quiet courage. And I thought about my father, a man I'd never known whose theoretical genius was now seeding a forest of new creation. Maybe you know what this feels like. Maybe you've spent your life on the outside of a closed door, listening to the party happening on the other side. Maybe you've been told your voice is too quiet, your ideas are too strange, your dreams are too small. Maybe you've been made to feel like a supporting character in someone else's story. If you have, I want you to hear this. The world is full of gatekeepers who will tell you that you're not enough. They will do it to protect their own fragile kingdoms, to quiet the sound of their own irrelevance. Do not listen. Your worth is not determined by their approval. Your value is not measured by their standards. Look at what you love. Look at the thing you create when no one is watching. That is where your soul is. Build there. The most powerful thing you can do is to stop waiting for an invitation and start building your own damn house. It will be harder than you can imagine, and it will be more beautiful than you ever dared to dream.